Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we travel to a warm summer's day in the year 1518 along a narrow cobbled city street in France where a single woman standing outside her home has begun to dance uncontrollably. The people around her are completely bewildered. There is no music, no celebration, no reason at all that anyone can see for her strange behavior, nor any indication of when it will come to an end. But she does not stop. Not for an hour, not for a day, not for nearly an entire week. Even after the soles of her feet turn bloody and the muscles in her body begin to cramp excruciatingly, she keeps dancing, drenched in sweat and wearing an emotionless expression that would perplex anyone who looked on. But the strangest part of all, one by one, her neighbors begin to join her. What started as a group of 36 quickly grows into hundreds across the city, all forcing themselves to dance relentlessly despite the agonizing pain, with no explanation from any physician. Nobody can make sense of it. The only answer that can be pieced together is that some unseen, sinister force has effectively made people prisoners of their own bodies. And as for the afflicted, according to historical accounts, most of them danced until they were dead. So before we drift any deeper into the dark, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of history I tell here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. I always find it fascinating to see who's gathered here in the quiet, scattered across the world, all listening to the same story at once. Now dim the lights, settle back, and let the centuries fall away around you. Because what happened in that city, in that summer, remains one of the most haunting mysteries history has ever left behind. And it began, as the very strangest things so often do, with a single woman and a single step. Let us go there now, in our minds, to that warm and ordinary morning in the middle of July, in the year 1518. The city is called Strasbourg, a place of timber-framed houses and narrow winding lanes, set on the banks of the river that runs through the region we now know as the borderlands of France and Germany. The day begins like any other. The bells of the great cathedral mark the hours. Merchants open their shutters. Carts rattle over the cobblestones. Smoke rises from 1,000 kitchen fires. It is a city going quietly about its business, as it has done for centuries, with no sense at all that it is about to become the stage for one of the most bizarre and terrible events in all of recorded history. And then, somewhere in those crowded streets, a woman steps out of her doorway. History has handed down to us a name for her, though we cannot be entirely certain of it. She is most often called Frau Trophia, an ordinary woman by every account, a wife, a neighbor, a face that the people of her street would have known and greeted 1,000 times without a second thought. There is nothing about her, on this particular morning, to suggest that anything is wrong. And then she begins to dance. There is no music playing. That is the first thing the people around her notice, and the first thing that makes no sense. It is not a feast day. There is no wedding, no festival, no celebration of any kind. There are no pipers, no drummers, no fiddlers. There is only the ordinary noise of the street and a woman in the middle of it, moving her body in the unmistakable motions of a dance to a rhythm that no one else can hear. Her arms rise and fall. Her feet step and turn. Her body sways and twists, and she does it with a strange, fixed intensity, as though she is caught up in something, swept along by some current that only she can feel. At first, surely, the reactions are mild. A raised eyebrow, a puzzled glance. Perhaps a few of her neighbors laugh or call out to her, asking what she is doing, telling her to stop her foolishness and come inside. Perhaps they assume she is playing some game, or has had too much to drink, or is simply behaving oddly for reasons of her own. People behave strangely sometimes. It is not, in the first hour, a cause for alarm. But the first hour passes, and she does not stop. The dancing continues, through the morning, into the afternoon, As the sun climbs and then begins to fall, she is still there, still moving, still dancing in the street to her silent and invisible music. And now, the puzzlement begins to curdle into something else. Now her neighbors are no longer laughing, because there is something deeply wrong about the way she dances. Her face, they notice, does not match her body. Her limbs move with the energy of celebration, but her face holds no joy at all. It is blank, distant, empty of any feeling, as though she herself is not entirely present, as though some part of her has gone somewhere far away while her body carries on without her. She does not seem to be enjoying herself. She does not seem to be doing this on purpose. She seems, more than anything, to be trapped. Imagine being one of those neighbors. Imagine standing in the street as the light begins to fade, watching a woman you have known for years dance on and on with that terrible empty look upon her face, and slowly understanding that she cannot stop, that she is not choosing this, that something has taken hold of her. You call her name and she does not answer. You reach out to take her arm and she dances on, slipping through your grasp, her feet never ceasing their motion. There is a particular kind of horror in watching a person you know become something you do not recognize, in seeing a familiar face emptied out and a familiar body moving to the command of something you cannot see. And that horror is only beginning, because night falls and still she dances. The street empties as people retreat to their homes, but she remains, a lone figure moving in the darkness, her silhouette swaying against the dim light of the windows. And when the sun rises again on the second day, she is still there, still dancing. She has not slept. She has not rested. She has danced through the entire night, alone, in the dark, to music that does not exist. The second day passes, and the third. By now, word has spread through the neighborhood, and people come to look at the strange woman who will not stop dancing. A crowd gathers, and what they see grows more disturbing with every passing hour, because her body is beginning to fail. The human body is not built to dance for days without rest, and the toll is becoming horribly visible. Her feet, in their thin shoes or perhaps bare against the cobblestones, are becoming raw and then bloody, leaving faint dark smears on the stones with every step. The accounts tell us her feet were bruised and bleeding, and still she danced upon them. Her muscles must have been screaming, cramping, seizing with the agony of ceaseless exertion. She would have been drenched in sweat, her clothes soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. By every measure of what a human body can endure, she should have collapsed. And perhaps she did collapse, now and then, falling to the ground in sheer exhaustion. But the accounts suggest that even then, she did not truly stop. She would rest only briefly, and then rise and dance again, driven by something relentless that would not release her. This went on, the records tell us, for somewhere between 4 and 6 days, nearly an entire week. Picture it, nearly a week of a single woman dancing in a city street, day and night, her feet bleeding, her body failing, her face empty, while a growing crowd of horrified neighbors looked on, helpless to stop her and utterly unable to understand what they were seeing. It is an image that, once you truly imagine it, is very difficult to forget. The sheer wronglessness of it, the relentlessness, the silence, broken only by the soft, terrible sound of her feet against the stones, on and on and on. And here we must pause to acknowledge something, because honesty matters, even in a story as strange as this one. The events we are describing come down to us from historical sources, from civic records and physicians' notes, and the accounts of chroniclers who lived in or near that time. These sources are real, and they are remarkable, and they are why we can speak of this event at all. But they are also, in places, incomplete, and the details were sometimes shaped by the understanding and the assumptions of the people who wrote them. The precise number of days, the exact identity of the woman, the specific details of her suffering, These come to us across 5 centuries, filtered through hands and minds very different from our own. So when we picture Frau Troffea dancing in the street, we are reconstructing, as faithfully as we can, an event that genuinely seems to have happened, while acknowledging that some of the finer details are uncertain and some are debated by the historians who have studied this strange affair. What is not in doubt is the broad and astonishing shape of it. A woman danced uncontrollably for days in the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg. That much the record makes clear. But if the story had ended there, with a single afflicted woman, it would be a strange and sad footnote, a curious case of one person's breakdown. It would not be the event that has haunted history for 500 years, because the truly extraordinary part, the part that lifts this from a personal tragedy into one of the great unsolved mysteries of the human story, is what happened next. The dancing did not stay with Frau Troffea. It did not stop when she, at last, was taken away. Instead, it spread, like a fire leaping from roof to roof, like a contagion passing from hand to hand. One by one, the people who had gathered to watch her began, themselves, to dance. And what had begun as the affliction of a single woman was about to become the affliction of an entire city. It began with a few. That is how these things so often begin. Within days of Frau Troffea taking to the streets, others joined her. We do not know exactly who they were, the first ones to feel the strange compulsion take hold. Perhaps they were among the crowd that had gathered to watch her. Perhaps they were neighbors or passers-by, or people who had heard the talk and come to see the spectacle for themselves. But one by one, they too began to dance. The same fixed, driven, joyless motion, the same blank and distant expression, the same terrible inability to stop. The accounts tell us that within a week, around 34 people had been seized by the compulsion. 34 men and women dancing in the streets of Strasbourg to no music, for no reason that anyone could name. And if a single dancing woman had been disturbing, a crowd of 36 was something else entirely. Something that began to look less like an isolated affliction and more like an outbreak. Something spreading. And spread it did. Because the dancing did not stop at 34. It kept growing, kept gathering, kept pulling more and more people into its terrible current. Within the space of about a month, the numbers had swelled to something almost impossible to comprehend. The accounts suggest that as many as 400 people were dancing through the streets of Strasbourg at the height of the affliction. 400. An entire crowd, a small army of the afflicted, moving day and night through the lanes and squares of the city, their bodies twisting and turning, their feet pounding the cobblestones, caught in a compulsion that none of them could break. Try to picture the city in those weeks. Try to imagine walking through Strasbourg as the affliction reached its peak. Everywhere you turn, there are people dancing. Not the joyful dancing of a festival, not the graceful dancing of a celebration, but this awful, relentless, mechanical motion performed by hundreds of exhausted and suffering bodies. They are in the marketplaces. They are in the squares. They are in the narrow streets and the open spaces, wherever there is room to move. And the sound of it, the constant shuffle and thud of hundreds of feet, the labored breathing, the occasional cry or moan, must have filled the city like a kind of terrible music of its own. And these dancers were not well. This is what makes the spectacle so harrowing. They were not enjoying themselves. They were suffering visibly and terribly, and yet they could not stop. They danced under the burning summer sun and through the cold of the night. They danced without food, without water, without rest. The accounts describe them suffering under extreme thirst and hunger, their bodies wasting and breaking down even as they continued to move. Their feet, like Frau Troffea's, became bloody and ruined. Their muscles cramped and tore. They sweated out what little moisture their bodies held. growing dangerously dehydrated under the summer heat. And still they danced. Their faces, witnesses said, were often empty or twisted with distress or fixed in expressions of fear and exhaustion. Some, it was said, cried out for help even as their bodies refused to obey them. Some seemed to beg to be allowed to stop, even as their feet carried on. Imagine that. Imagine being trapped inside your own body, watching it dance you toward your own destruction, screaming for it to cease and finding that it will not listen. This is the image that the people of Strasbourg captured in their own bewildered way when they tried to describe what they were witnessing. They had no concept of the things we might reach for today. They knew nothing of neurology, of psychology, of the strange disorders of the mind and body that modern science would later try to use to explain this affair. What they saw with their own eyes was people who had become prisoners inside their own flesh. People whose bodies had been seized by some force that drove them to dance against their will, against their own desperate desire to stop, against the very survival of their bodies. And the only way they could make sense of it, with the understanding available to them, was to imagine an unseen power at work. Something sinister. Something that had taken hold of these poor souls and would not let them go until it had danced them into the ground. And here we come to the darkest fact of all, the fact that transforms this from a bizarre curiosity into a genuine horror. The dancers did not simply dance and then recover. Many of them, according to the historical accounts, danced until their bodies gave out completely, until their hearts, strained beyond all endurance by days of ceaseless exertion in the summer heat, simply failed, until they collapsed from exhaustion or suffered what we might now recognize as heart attacks or strokes and died. There is a figure that comes down to us from one of the historical sources, a chilling claim that at the peak of the affliction, as many as 15 people were dying every single day. Now, this number is debated, and many historians treat it with real caution, because the surviving records are incomplete and the figure may be exaggerated or unreliable. We genuinely do not know precisely how many people died in the dancing plague of 1518. But that such a claim was recorded at all, that contemporaries believed people were dying in significant numbers from dancing, tells us something about the scale and the terror of what was unfolding. People were dancing themselves to death. Whether it was 15 a day or far fewer, the essential horror remains. This was not a harmless oddity. This was a phenomenon that was killing the people it touched, working them to death through their own unstoppable motion. And no one could stop it. This is the part that must have been so maddening, so terrifying for the people of Strasbourg. They were not helpless in the face of an enemy they could fight. There was no army to repel, no fire to extinguish, no flood to hold back. The enemy was invisible, and it lived inside the bodies of their own friends and family and neighbors. How do you fight something like that? How do you save a person whose own body has turned against them? You cannot hold them down, for they will only struggle and dance the moment you release them. You cannot reason with them, for they seem beyond the reach of reason. You cannot wait for it to pass, for it does not pass, and meanwhile they are dying before your eyes. The people of Strasbourg were trapped in a nightmare with no apparent escape, watching their city consumed by an affliction they could neither understand nor halt. So they did what people in such situations have always done. They turned to their leaders and to their learned men for answers. The city authorities, the magistrates and councillors who governed Strasbourg, could not simply ignore an event of this magnitude. Hundreds of their citizens were dancing in the streets and dying. Something had to be done. And so they summoned the people who, in that age, were supposed to understand such mysteries. The physicians, the men of learning, the authorities of body and of soul. And they asked them the question that hung over the entire city, the question that still hangs over it 500 years later. What is happening? And how do we make it stop? But before we follow the desperate efforts of the authorities to answer that question, we have to step back and understand the world in which this was happening. Because the dancing plague did not strike a happy and contented city. It struck a place that was already suffering, a place already pushed to the very edge of what its people could bear. And to understand why hundreds of people might suddenly dance themselves to death, we first have to understand the darkness that had already settled over Strasbourg long before the first step was ever taken. To understand what happened in the summer of 1518, you have to understand the place where it happened and the world that place belonged to. Because Strasbourg was not some remote and backward village lost at the edge of civilization. It was, in fact, one of the more prosperous and important cities of its region, a thriving center of trade and craft and learning on the great river that linked the lands of Central Europe. And yet, for all its prosperity, it was a city living under enormous strain, in an age of hardship and fear that we, in our comfortable modern lives, can scarcely imagine. Let us set the scene. In 1518, Strasbourg was a free city, largely self-governing, nestled in the region of Alsace, on the western bank of the Rhine, in the borderlands of what is today France and Germany. It was a place of considerable wealth and bustle. Its skyline was dominated by the great cathedral, one of the tallest buildings in all of Europe at the time, its spire rising high above the timber roofs of the town. Beneath it spread a dense maze of narrow streets and crowded houses, workshops and markets, churches and guild halls. The city was home to merchants and craftsmen, to weavers and tanners and bakers and smiths, organized into the powerful guilds that governed so much of urban life. It sat at a crossroads of trade, with goods and people flowing through it along the river and the roads, connecting it to the wider world of commerce and ideas. It was also a city governed by a council of leading citizens, men drawn from the guilds and the prominent families who managed the city's affairs, kept its order, and answered, in their own minds, to both worldly authority and to God. These were practical men, accustomed to dealing with the ordinary problems of a busy city, with trade disputes and crime and the maintenance of the walls and the markets. They were not, by and large, men given to wild superstition. When the dancing began, their instinct would be to seek practical, reasoned solutions, to consult the experts, to take measured action. They were, in a sense, men of the early modern world, standing at the very dawn of a more rational age. And they were about to be confronted with something that would defy every rational tool they possessed. For this was a particular moment in history, a hinge between two worlds. The year 1518 sat near the end of the medieval age and the beginning of what we now call the early modern period. It was a time of profound change and profound tension. Just 1 year earlier, in 1517, a monk named Martin Luther had, according to tradition, nailed his famous theses to a church door in distant Germany, lighting the spark that would become the Protestant Reformation, an upheaval that would shatter the religious unity of Europe and plunge the continent into more than a century of conflict and transformation. The old certainties were beginning to crack. The authority of the Church, which had governed the spiritual life of Europe for 1,000 years, was being questioned as never before. New ideas were spreading, carried on the new technology of the printing press. It was an age of anxiety, of flux, of a world that seemed to be shifting beneath people's feet. And in such an age, when the great structures that gave life its meaning begin to tremble, people grow fearful and uncertain and vulnerable in ways that are difficult to measure but very real. And the spiritual world of these people was utterly saturated with religion in a way that shaped every aspect of how they understood their lives and their sufferings. To the people of Strasbourg in 1518, the world was a place alive with unseen forces. God watched over all and could punish or reward, send plagues or grant mercy. Saints could intercede, could heal, could afflict. The devil and his demons were real and active presences, capable of tempting, possessing, and tormenting the living. Misfortune was rarely seen as random. It had meaning. It had a cause, often a moral or spiritual cause. A disease, a disaster, a strange affliction. These were not merely natural events, but signs, messages, punishments, the workings of powers beyond the human. So when something as bizarre and terrible as the dancing began, the people of Strasbourg could not, see it as a simple medical curiosity. They saw it as something charged with spiritual meaning, something that might be a curse or a punishment, or the work of a saint, or the meddling of the devil himself. This religious understanding would shape everything about how they responded to the crisis, as we shall see. But beneath the religious anxiety and the broader tensions of the age, there was something more immediate, more physical, more brutal weighing upon the people of Strasbourg in those years. They were suffering, genuinely, deeply, bodily suffering. The years leading up to 1518 had been, for the common people of the region, a time of terrible hardship, a relentless succession of miseries that had ground them down and left them desperate, malnourished, frightened, and exhausted. To truly understand why the dancing plague took hold when and where it did, we have to understand this suffering. We have to understand just how much the ordinary people of Strasbourg had already endured before that first woman ever stepped into the street to dance. Because a population at the very limit of its endurance, a population starving and sick and terrified, is a population in which strange and terrible things become possible, and that is exactly what Strasbourg was in the summer of 1518, a city of people pushed to the very edge. Let us look now at the darkness that had brought them there. If you had walked the streets of Strasbourg in the years just before the dancing began, you would not have found a happy or a contented people. You would have found a population worn thin by hardship, ground down by a relentless succession of miseries, living always in the shadow of hunger and disease and death. Because the early 16th century, in this corner of Europe, was a time of profound and grinding suffering for the common people, and the years immediately preceding 1518 had been especially cruel. To understand the dancing plague, we have to understand this suffering, for it lies at the very heart of every serious attempt to explain what happened. Let us begin with the most fundamental hardship of all, hunger. The people of Strasbourg, like people across so much of Europe in those years, were going hungry. The harvests had been failing. A run of bitterly cold winters and cold, wet summers had ruined crop after crop, and the agricultural systems of the time, always balanced on a knife's edge, could not absorb such repeated blows. We now understand that this period fell within a broader span of climatic cooling, a stretch of centuries that historians sometimes call the Little Ice Age, when temperatures across Europe dropped and the weather turned harsher and more unpredictable. For the people living through it, of course, there was no grand name for what was happening. There was only the cold and the rain and the rotting crops and the dwindling stores of food and the rising fear of what the winter would bring. When harvests fail, the price of food rises, and it rises most cruelly for those who can least afford it. In the years around 1518, the price of grain in the region had climbed to punishing heights. Bread, the very staff of life for the common people, the foundation of nearly every meal, became expensive and then scarce, and for the poorest, sometimes simply unattainable. Imagine the desperation of a family watching the price of bread climb beyond their reach, watching their children grow thin, rationing what little they had, never quite sure where the next meal would come from. This was not an occasional hardship. This was the texture of daily life for a great many people in Strasbourg in those years. A constant, gnawing, fearful hunger that wore away at the body and at the spirit alike. And hunger, as it always does, brought its companions. A malnourished population is a weakened population, and a weakened population is prey to disease. The years around 1518 saw waves of sickness sweep through the region, feeding on bodies already made fragile by want. There was smallpox, that ancient scourge that scarred and killed in terrible numbers. There was the disease that contemporaries were beginning to call the new sickness, which we would recognize as syphilis, then spreading across Europe and inspiring particular horror as a strange and shameful new affliction. There was leprosy, that most feared of diseases, which cast its victims out from society entirely. And always, lurking in the background of the age, there was the memory and the recurring threat of the plague itself, the great pestilence that had devastated Europe in centuries past and still returned again and again to cull the populations of its cities. Death, in short, was everywhere. It walked the streets of Strasbourg in a dozen forms, and no one, rich or poor, could feel entirely safe from it. To all of this we must add the floods. The river that gave Strasbourg its life and its trade could also turn against it, and in these years the waters rose and overflowed, drowning fields, destroying stores, spreading filth and disease through the low-lying districts. Each disaster compounded the last. A flood ruined the crops that hunger had already made precious. Disease swept through bodies that hunger had already weakened. The cold deepened the misery of the hungry and the sick. It was a vicious, interlocking cycle of suffering, and the common people of Strasbourg were caught in the middle of it, with little power to escape and little hope of relief. Now, I want you to do something as you lie there in the quiet and the dark. I want you to try to feel your way into that experience. Not just to know it as a list of facts, but to imagine, for a moment, what it would actually have been like to live inside it. Imagine waking each morning already tired, already hungry, your body weak from months of poor food. Imagine the constant low fear that hums beneath everything, the fear of the next failed harvest, the next outbreak of sickness, the next death in the family or among the neighbors. Imagine watching people you love grow thin and sick and being powerless to help them. Imagine the relentless physical hardship of it, the cold, the hunger, the labor that never ceased, no matter how weak you became. And imagine carrying all of this, not for a week or a month, but for years on end, with no end in sight, in a world where you had been taught that suffering was often a punishment, a sign of divine displeasure, a darkness that you yourself might somehow have brought down upon your own head. This is the state in which we find the people of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, not merely uncomfortable, not merely worried, but pushed, many of them, to the absolute edge of what a human being can endure. Starving, sick, exhausted, frightened, living in a world that seemed to be cursed or punished or abandoned by the God who was supposed to protect them, carrying a burden of fear and grief and physical misery so heavy that it is genuinely difficult for us, in our comfortable age, to fully grasp it. And it is no accident the leading thinkers on this subject will tell us that the dancing plague struck precisely such a population at precisely such a moment, a people stretched to their absolute limit, a people whose bodies and minds had been pushed beyond what they could bear. We will return to this idea again and again as we explore what might actually have caused the dancing. Because whatever the precise mechanism, whatever the true explanation, almost every serious attempt to understand the dancing plague begins in the same place. It begins with suffering. It begins with a population already broken, already at the breaking point, before the first step was ever danced. Hold that in your mind as we go on. A city of the suffering, a people at the edge, and into that fragile, fearful, exhausted world, the dancing came. And the men who governed the city, faced with hundreds of their citizens dancing themselves to death, had to find some way to understand it and some way to make it stop. They turned to the wisest and most learned men they knew, and the answer those men gave would prove to be one of the most catastrophic medical decisions in all of history. When the dancing could no longer be ignored, when the numbers had swelled and the deaths had begun and the city was gripped by fear, the authorities of Strasbourg did what responsible authorities do. They sought expert advice. They turned to the learned men of their age, to the physicians, the men who had studied the workings of the human body and who were presumed to understand the causes and the cures of affliction. And the verdict those physicians reached, and the course of action it produced, is one of the most extraordinary and tragic episodes in the entire story. Because in trying to cure the dancing plague, the authorities of Strasbourg, acting on the best medical advice available to them, almost certainly made it far, far worse. To understand how this happened, we have to understand how the physicians of 1518 thought about the human body, because their entire framework was built on foundations that we now know to be completely mistaken. The medicine of that age was inherited from the ancient world, from the great Greek and Roman physicians whose writings had been preserved and revered for over 1,000 years. And at the very center of that medicine sat a single powerful idea: the theory of the four humours. The body, in this understanding, was governed by four fluids, or humours. There was blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile. Each was associated with particular qualities, with heat and cold, with moisture and dryness. And health, in this framework, was a matter of balance. When the four humours were in proper proportion, a person was well. When they fell out of balance, when there was too much of one or too little of another, sickness followed. The physician's task, therefore, was to diagnose which humour had grown excessive or deficient, and to restore the proper balance, whether by removing what was in excess through such methods as bloodletting or by other adjustments of diet, environment, and regimen. It was an elegant and internally consistent system. It was also, as a description of how the body actually works, almost entirely wrong. But it was all they had, and they applied it with complete sincerity. So when the physicians of Strasbourg examined the dancing plague through the lens of this theory, what did they conclude? Here we come to a crucial point. They did not, in the main, conclude that the dancing was supernatural. This is worth dwelling on because it surprises many people. We might expect that in such a deeply religious and superstitious age, the immediate verdict would have been demonic possession or divine punishment or witchcraft. And certainly such ideas were in the air, and many ordinary people surely believed them. But the learned physicians, the official experts consulted by the city, appear to have largely set aside the supernatural explanations. They did not declare the dancers to be possessed by demons. They did not, in their official capacity, blame the devil or witchcraft. Instead, they reached for a natural explanation drawn from their humoral medicine. And the explanation they settled on was this: the dancing, they declared, was caused by overheated blood, hot blood. That was the verdict. The bodies of the afflicted, the physicians reasoned, had become overheated. Their blood had grown too hot, throwing their humours violently out of balance, and this overheating was what drove them into their frenzied, ceaseless motion. It was, in their understanding, a natural disorder of the body, a kind of fever of the blood that expressed itself through compulsive dancing. And from this diagnosis flowed a course of treatment that seems, to us, almost insane in its logic, and yet followed perfectly reasonably from the premises they held. Think it through with their logic. If the problem is overheated blood, and the dancing is the body's expression of that overheating, then how do you cure it? You might think the answer would be to cool the body, to calm it, to force it to rest. But the physicians reasoned differently. They concluded that the afflicted needed to work the heat out of their systems, that the hot blood had to be burned off, exhausted, danced out of the body until the fever broke and the balance was restored. In other words, the cure for compulsive, deadly dancing was, in their view, more dancing. The afflicted should be allowed, even encouraged, to dance until they had worked the affliction out of themselves entirely. Pause and sit with the horror of that conclusion. People were dancing themselves to death. They were collapsing from exhaustion, suffering heart failure, dying in the streets from the sheer physical toll of ceaseless motion. And the official medical verdict was that the solution was to help them dance more, to facilitate the very behavior that was killing them. It is one of the most catastrophic misdiagnoses in the history of medicine, a perfect and tragic example of how a completely wrong understanding of the body can lead intelligent, well-meaning people to do precisely the opposite of what would help. The physicians were not cruel. They were not fools by the standards of their time. They were applying the best medical theory available to them, reasoning carefully from principles they had every reason to trust. And in doing so, they prescribed a remedy that could only make the catastrophe worse. We should pause to be fair to them, as we have tried to be fair throughout this story. These men were working with a map of the human body that did not match reality, and they could not have known it. The true causes of the dancing plague, whatever they were, lay entirely beyond the reach of their knowledge. They had no concept of the psychological forces, the neurological possibilities, the toxicological theories that modern thinkers would later bring to bear on this mystery. They had their humors and their hot blood and their centuries of inherited wisdom, and they did the best they could with it. The tragedy is not that they were stupid. The tragedy is that they were confidently, sincerely, and catastrophically wrong in a moment when being wrong cost lives. And so, armed with this verdict, the authorities of Strasbourg made a decision. If the afflicted needed to dance out their affliction, then the city would help them do exactly that. They would not try to stop the dancing. They would not confine the dancers, or restrain them, or force them to rest. Instead, they would give them every opportunity and every encouragement to dance as much and as hard as possible until the hot blood was burned away and the affliction passed. They set about, in other words, to organize the dancing, to facilitate it, to provide the afflicted with space and music and partners and everything they might need to keep moving. It was, in their minds, the compassionate and the rational thing to do, the application of expert medical advice to a terrible crisis, and it would prove to be a disaster almost beyond imagining. Having decided that the dancers must be allowed, and even helped, to dance their affliction out of their bodies, the authorities of Strasbourg set about putting that decision into practice. And the measures they took, in their sincere and disastrous attempt to help, turned the dancing plague from a terrible affliction into something close to a public spectacle of mass suffering. This chapter is, in many ways, the dark heart of the whole story. The moment when the well-meaning efforts of the city to cure its citizens instead drove them further toward their deaths. First, the authorities needed space. Hundreds of people were dancing, and the streets and squares, busy with the ordinary traffic of a working city, were not ideal for the purpose. So the city set aside places for the dancing to happen. The accounts tell us that they opened up guild halls, the large communal buildings belonging to the city's trade associations, and turned them over to the dancers. They cleared out marketplaces. They designated open spaces where the afflicted could gather and move freely. In at least one account, the city went so far as to construct a wooden stage, a platform built specifically to give the dancers a place to perform their endless, agonized motion. Think about what that means. The city built a stage for the dancing plague. They created infrastructure for it. They made physical, permanent arrangements to accommodate hundreds of people dancing themselves toward death. But space alone was not enough. If the goal was to keep the afflicted dancing, to help them work the hot blood out of their bodies, then they needed to be kept moving, energized, sustained in their motion. And so the authorities made a decision that, in hindsight, seems almost unbelievable in its wrongness. They brought in music. They hired professional musicians, pipers and drummers to play for the dancers, to provide the rhythm and the energy that would keep them moving. Where before the afflicted had danced in eerie silence, to music only they could hear, now the streets and halls of Strasbourg rang with actual music, played by hired musicians, specifically to encourage and sustain the very dancing that was killing people. And they went further still. The accounts suggest that the city also hired strong, healthy dancers, professional dancers, and other able-bodied people to dance alongside the afflicted. The thinking, presumably, was that these fresh dancers could keep the afflicted company, could partner with them, could help sustain the momentum and keep the dancing going. So now we have a truly extraordinary and horrifying scene. The afflicted dancing themselves to ruin, surrounded by hired musicians playing lively tunes, accompanied by hired dancers brought in to keep the motion going, all of it organized and sponsored by the city authorities in the sincere belief that this was the path to a cure. You can perhaps already see the catastrophe taking shape, because of course this did not cure anyone. How could it? The afflicted were not suffering from an excess of hot blood that needed to be danced away. Whatever was truly wrong with them, encouraging them to dance harder and longer, providing them with music and partners and stages, could only worsen their physical condition, driving their exhausted bodies further past the point of endurance. The cure was not merely useless, it was actively, lethally harmful. Every hour of additional dancing was an hour of additional strain on hearts and muscles and bodies already pushed to their limits. The music and the partners and the stages did not help the afflicted recover. They helped the afflicted die. And there was a second, even more insidious effect, one that the authorities certainly did not anticipate. By organizing the dancing, by providing music and stages and a public spectacle, the city may well have spread the affliction further. Remember how the dancing had begun with a single woman and then spread to those who watched her. There was something contagious about it, something that passed from the afflicted to the onlookers, drawing more and more people into the terrible motion. And now the city had created a grand, public, music-filled spectacle of dancing right in the heart of the town for everyone to see. If the dancing spread through some process of suggestion, of contagion, of one person catching it from another, then the city's response was very nearly the worst thing it could possibly have done. It gathered the dancing into a great visible display, set it to music, and put it on a stage for the whole population to witness. We cannot be certain how much this worsened the spread, but it is entirely plausible, and many who have studied this affair believe that the city's well-meaning intervention poured fuel on the very fire it was trying to put out. For a time, then, the situation spiraled. More dancers, more deaths, more music playing as people collapsed and died. The accounts of this period are genuinely harrowing if you allow yourself to picture them. The guild halls and marketplaces of Strasbourg filled with hundreds of dancing figures, the air ringing with hired music, and among the dancers, people failing, faltering, falling. People dying of exhaustion and heart failure even as the pipes played on. It must have been a scene from a nightmare, a grotesque and terrible carnival of suffering, organized and sustained by the very authorities who were trying to help. But the authorities of Strasbourg were not stupid men, and they were not heartless. As the days passed and the deaths mounted, as it became horribly clear that the dancing was not abating but worsening, that people were dying in greater numbers rather than recovering, they began to realize that their approach had failed. Catastrophically. Whatever the physicians had told them, whatever the theory of hot blood had promised, the evidence before their eyes was undeniable. Encouraging the dancing was not curing it. It was killing people. And so, at last, the authorities reversed course. They changed their entire approach. They stopped the music. They sent away the hired dancers. They closed the stages and the halls. And they began to forbid the dancing instead of encouraging it, to suppress it rather than facilitate it. But suppression brought its own problems, for how do you forbid a thing that the afflicted cannot control? You can stop the music and dismantle the stages, but the people gripped by the compulsion will go on dancing regardless, for they are not dancing by choice. And so the authorities, having abandoned the medical approach, turned in a new direction entirely. If the dancing could not be cured by medicine, and could not be stopped by force, then perhaps it could be addressed by a higher power. Perhaps the answer lay not with the physicians, but with the saints and with God. The crisis was about to take a turn from the medical to the sacred, and the afflicted of Strasbourg were about to be led on a strange and desperate pilgrimage in search of a cure from the one source the people of that age trusted above all others, the realm of the holy. When medicine had failed, when the music and the stages and the theory of hot blood had only deepened the catastrophe, the people of Strasbourg turned to the one power they trusted above all others. They turned to heaven, and in doing so, they reached for a figure whose name had been bound up with compulsive dancing for centuries, a saint who, in the belief of the age, could both inflict this affliction and cure it. His name was Saint Vitus. And to understand the strange pilgrimage that followed, we have to understand the peculiar and unsettling place that this saint held in the imagination of late medieval Europe. Saint Vitus was an ancient Christian martyr, a young man said to have died for his faith in the early centuries of the Church. Over the long span of medieval history, like many saints, he had accumulated particular associations, particular powers and patronages in the minds of the faithful. And one of the associations that had attached itself to St. Vitus was a connection to dancing, and to a particular kind of affliction involving involuntary, convulsive movement. There was even a condition, a genuine neurological disorder involving uncontrollable jerking and writhing movements that came to be known as St. Vitus's dance, a name that survived for centuries as the popular term for such symptoms. The link between this saint and the phenomenon of uncontrollable motion ran deep in the culture of the time, and here is where the belief grew dark and strange. Because Saint Vitus was understood not only as a potential healer of such afflictions, but, in some traditions, as a potential cause of them. It was believed, in parts of Europe, that Saint Vitus had the power to curse people with compulsive dancing, that if the saint were angered, or if one failed to honor him properly, he might send down upon a person the affliction of ceaseless, uncontrollable dancing as a punishment or a sign of his displeasure. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and we will return to its significance later, because it may be far more central to the whole mystery than it first appears. For now, simply hold this fact in your mind. The people of this region carried within them a deep, pre-existing belief that an uncontrollable dancing affliction was a real thing, a known thing, a thing associated with a specific saint who could both inflict it and lift it. They did not encounter the dancing plague as something wholly without precedent or meaning. They encountered it as the manifestation of a curse they already believed in. So when the medical approach failed, it was natural, even inevitable, that the authorities and the people would turn to St. Vitus. If the dancing was, after all, the work of the saint, whether as a curse or a trial, then the cure must lie in appeasing him, in seeking his mercy, in performing the proper acts of devotion to win back his favor and persuade him to release the afflicted from their torment. And so the authorities of Strasbourg organized what amounted to a great religious intervention, a pilgrimage of the afflicted to a holy site dedicated to the saint. The accounts tell us that the dancers, or many of them, were gathered up and taken out of the city, away from the streets and squares where they had danced, and brought to a shrine of St. Vitus located in the hills and mountains beyond Strasbourg, in a place associated with the saint's veneration. There, at this holy site, a series of rituals was performed in the hope of curing the afflicted through the intercession of the saint. And these rituals were strange and specific, and have come down to us as some of the most haunting details of the entire affair. The afflicted, we are told, were given red shoes. There is something almost unbearably poignant and eerie about this detail, this image of dancers cursed with ceaseless motion being fitted with red shoes as part of their cure, an image that would echo down through the centuries and into folklore and story. The shoes, in some accounts, were anointed or blessed, marked with holy symbols. The afflicted were led in procession around a wooden image of St. Vitus, a carved figure or effigy of the saint, before whom they were to perform their devotions. Crosses were placed in their hands. Holy water was used. Incense was burned. The priests performed the sacred rites. Prayers were offered. Masses were said. The entire apparatus of the church's holy power was brought to bear upon the afflicted in the hope of persuading St. Vitus to lift the curse and release them from their dance. And here is the remarkable thing. According to the historical accounts, it seemed to work. After this turn toward the sacred, after the pilgrimage and the rituals at the shrine of St. Vitus, the dancing plague began, at last, to subside. The afflicted, one by one, were released from their compulsion. The dancing slowed, and then it stopped. The outbreak that had gripped Strasbourg for weeks or months, that had killed an unknown number of its citizens and terrorized the entire city, finally, mercifully, came to an end. By late summer or early autumn of 1518, it appears the dancing plague was over. Now, we have to think carefully about what this means and resist the temptation to draw simple conclusions. Did St. Vitus cure the dancing plague? Did the rituals at the shrine actually work some genuine power? We should be cautious here and honest. The end of the dancing plague coincided with the religious intervention, but coincidence is not proof of cause. There are other possibilities. Perhaps the affliction had simply run its course, as such outbreaks tend to do, burning itself out naturally as the weeks passed. Perhaps the removal of the afflicted from the public spectacle of the city, the very thing that may have spread the dancing, helped to break the contagion. Perhaps the change of environment, the journey, the rest, the calming structure of religious ritual had a genuine psychological effect on people whose affliction may have been psychological in nature, a possibility we will explore in depth later. Or perhaps the timing was simply that, timing, and the dancing would have ended when it did regardless. But here is what we can say, and what is genuinely significant. If the dancing plague was, at its root, a phenomenon driven by belief, by the deep and shared conviction that St. Vitus could inflict and lift an uncontrollable dancing curse, then it makes a strange and powerful sense that a ritual invoking that very saint, performed with full sincerity and authority, might have been exactly the thing to bring it to an end. If the affliction grew from belief, then it might be cured by belief. The same conviction that could make people dance might, properly invoked, make them stop. We will come back to this idea because it sits very close to the heart of the most compelling modern explanation for the whole affair. For now, let us simply note the strange symmetry of it. The dancing plague may have been born from a belief in St. Vitus, and it may have been ended by an appeal to the very same saint. So the dancing stopped. The city, battered and grieving, slowly returned to something like its ordinary life. The stages were dismantled. The music fell silent. The afflicted who had survived returned to their homes and their families, carrying whatever memories and wounds the affliction had left them. And Strasbourg was left to count its dead and to wonder, as we still wonder today, what exactly had happened to it. Before we turn to the great question of what caused the dancing plague, we should pause to reckon honestly with that toll, with the human cost of those terrible weeks. Because behind the strangeness and the mystery, real people suffered and real people died. It is easy, when telling a story as bizarre as the dancing plague, to become so caught up in the strangeness of it that we lose sight of the suffering at its center. The image of hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably through the streets of a medieval city is so peculiar, so almost unbelievable, that it can begin to feel like a curiosity, a historical oddity, a strange tale to marvel at. But we must not let it become only that, because the dancing plague was not a curiosity to the people who lived through it. It was a catastrophe. It was weeks of horror and grief and death. And the dancers were not figures in a strange tableau. They were people, real people, with names and families and lives, who suffered terribly, and many of whom died. So let us pause here in the quiet and reckon honestly with what the dancing plague actually cost. We have spoken already of the disputed figure that has come down to us from the historical record, the claim that at the peak of the affliction, as many as 15 people were dying every single day. I want to return to that figure and treat it with the care it deserves, because it matters, and because the truth is more uncertain and more complicated than a single dramatic number might suggest. That figure of 15 deaths a day comes from a historical source, and it has been repeated many times in the telling of this story. But historians who have studied the dancing plague urge real caution about it. The surviving records from 1518 are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Numbers in sources from this period are often unreliable, sometimes exaggerated for effect, sometimes simply guessed at. We genuinely do not have a precise, trustworthy death toll for the dancing plague. We cannot say with confidence whether dozens died or scores, or whether the higher figures are inflated. But here is what we can say. The contemporary sources clearly believed that people were dying, and dying in significant numbers, as a direct result of the dancing. They recorded deaths. They spoke of the afflicted collapsing and perishing. The belief that the dancing plague was lethal, that it killed the people it touched, runs through the accounts. And when we consider what the dancing actually involved, this belief becomes entirely credible, regardless of the exact numbers. Because dancing without rest, for days on end, in the summer heat, without adequate food or water, is genuinely deadly. The human body cannot sustain such exertion. We can understand, with our modern knowledge, exactly how such dancing would kill. Consider what would have happened to those bodies. Days of ceaseless, frenzied motion would have placed an enormous and unrelenting strain on the heart. For people already weakened by the malnutrition and hardship of those famine years, that strain could easily have proven fatal, the heart simply giving out under the impossible demand placed upon it. We would call it, today, a heart attack, or cardiac arrest, or heart failure. The dancers were, in effect, forcing their hearts to run a marathon that never ended, until those hearts could run no more. Others may have suffered strokes, as the extreme exertion and dehydration and strain took their toll on the blood vessels of the brain, and many would simply have collapsed from sheer exhaustion and dehydration, their bodies failing entirely after days without rest or adequate water in the heat of a summer spent in constant motion. These are not exotic or mysterious causes of death. They are the predictable, physical consequences of doing to a human body exactly what the dancing plague did. The mystery of the dancing plague is not how the dancers died. We understand that all too well. The mystery is why they danced at all. Try, once more, to picture the human reality of it. Picture a man who has danced for 3 days, his body wasted, his feet destroyed, his heart hammering against his ribs, and who feels, finally, that heart begin to fail, even as his legs carry him on in their relentless motion. Picture his family, watching, having tried everything, having begged him to stop, having seen the music and the stages and the rituals all fail, now watching him die before their eyes, dancing, unable to take him in their arms because his body will not cease its terrible motion. Picture the grief of that, the helplessness, the horror of losing someone not to a sword or a fever or an accident, but to dancing, to an affliction so strange that no one could even name its cause. This was the reality, repeated again and again through those weeks in Strasbourg. Real deaths, real grief, real families shattered by an affliction from beyond all understanding. And consider, too, the psychological toll on the survivors and the witnesses. The people who danced and lived would have carried the memory of that experience for the rest of their days, the terror of having been trapped inside their own bodies, driven to dance against their will, watching others die around them. And the people who watched, the families and neighbors and the whole population of the city, would have carried their own scars, the trauma of having witnessed something so wrong, so inexplicable, so terrible, unfold in their own streets. A whole city was marked by what happened in the summer of 1518. The dancing plague did not end cleanly when the dancing stopped. It left wounds in bodies and in minds that would not soon heal. There is one more thing worth saying here before we move on to the great question of cause. The dancing plague, for all its horror, was handled by the people of Strasbourg with a kind of desperate seriousness and care that we should not overlook. They did not simply abandon the afflicted to die. They tried, in every way they knew, to help them. They consulted their experts. They organized their response. They spent the city's resources. They turned to their faith. They went to enormous lengths, even if many of those efforts were misguided or made things worse, to try to save their suffering fellow citizens. There is, in that effort, however flawed, something deeply human and even moving. A community confronting an incomprehensible horror and refusing, despite everything, to simply give up on the people it was destroying. That impulse, the refusal to abandon the suffering even when we cannot understand or cure their suffering, is one of the better parts of human nature, and it shone through even in the darkness of 1518. So the dancing plague ended, and Strasbourg counted its dead and tried to heal. But the great question remained, unanswered then and debated still. What had happened? What force had seized those hundreds of people and danced them to their deaths? Before we explore the theories that modern thinkers have proposed, there is something crucial we must understand. The dancing plague of 1518 was not the first time this had happened. It was not a unique, isolated event. It was, astonishingly, part of a pattern, one of a series of such outbreaks that had haunted Europe for centuries before. And that pattern deepens the mystery enormously. Here is one of the most surprising and unsettling facts in the entire story, a fact that transforms the dancing plague of 1518 from a bizarre one-off event into something far stranger and far more profound. Strasbourg was not the first. The dancing plague of 1518 was not a unique occurrence, not an isolated freak of history. It was, in fact, the last and one of the best documented examples of a phenomenon that had appeared again and again across medieval Europe over the preceding centuries. People had been seized by uncontrollable, compulsive, contagious dancing before, many times, in many places. There was a pattern, and understanding that pattern is essential to understanding what may have been happening in Strasbourg. Historians have a name for this broader phenomenon. They call it dancing mania, or sometimes choreomania, from the Greek words for dance and madness. And the records of it stretch back across centuries. Time and again, in towns and cities across the lands of medieval Europe, particularly in the regions along the great rivers and in the German-speaking lands and the Low Countries, groups of people had been gripped by the same strange affliction. They would begin to dance uncontrollably, often in large numbers, sometimes for days or weeks, frequently suffering and occasionally dying before the outbreak finally subsided. The dancing plague of 1518 was the most famous and best recorded of these episodes, but it was far from the only one. One of the most significant earlier outbreaks occurred well over a century before Strasbourg in the year 1374. This was a major episode of dancing mania that swept through the region of the Rhine, affecting numerous towns and cities across what is now Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In places such as Aachen and Cologne, and other towns along the Great River and beyond, large numbers of people were seized by the compulsion to dance. The accounts of this outbreak describe scenes remarkably similar to those of Strasbourg. Crowds of people dancing wildly, seemingly unable to stop, often appearing to be in a kind of trance or altered state, sometimes claiming to see visions, sometimes crying out, dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. This outbreak of 1374 spread from place to place, moving through the region, gripping town after town, a contagion of dancing that ran through the population like a fever. It was, in many ways, a clear forerunner of what would happen in Strasbourg nearly a century and a half later. And the 1374 outbreak was itself not the first. There are records and accounts, some more reliable than others, of dancing manias and related phenomena stretching back even further into the medieval period. There are medieval chronicles describing groups of people, sometimes children, seized by compulsions to dance or to move or to travel in strange processions. There is a famous and somewhat legendary account from the 13th century describing a group of children who supposedly danced or processed from one town to another in a strange, compelled migration. The historical reliability of some of these earlier accounts is uncertain, and they blend, at times, into the realm of legend and folklore. But taken together, they suggest that the phenomenon of compulsive, contagious dancing was something that recurred across the medieval centuries, a strange thread woven through the history of the age, appearing and reappearing in different times and places. This phenomenon was sometimes associated, as in Strasbourg, with Saint Vitus, and the affliction was sometimes called Saint Vitus's dance. In other contexts, it was linked to Saint John, and there were traditions of dancing associated with the feast of Saint John. The religious framing varied, but the core phenomenon remained recognizably the same. People, often in groups, seized by an uncontrollable compulsion to dance, suffering and sometimes dying as a result, the affliction spreading from person to person and place to place before finally burning itself out. Now, why does this pattern matter so much for our understanding of 1518? It matters for several reasons, and they are worth thinking through carefully. First, the existence of a pattern tells us that whatever caused the dancing plague was not some unique, one-time accident, some freak combination of circumstances that occurred only once in Strasbourg. It was something that could happen, and did happen, repeatedly, under the right conditions. This means that any explanation we propose for the dancing plague must be able to account not just for one outbreak, but for a recurring phenomenon that appeared across centuries and across a wide region. That is a significant constraint, and it helps us evaluate the various theories. Second, the pattern reveals something about the conditions under which these outbreaks occurred. When historians look at the recorded episodes of dancing mania, they notice something striking. These outbreaks tended to cluster in times and places of particular hardship and distress. They came in the wake of famines, of floods, of epidemics, of social upheaval. They struck populations that were suffering, frightened, pushed to the edge of endurance, exactly as Strasbourg was in 1518. This correlation between dancing mania and times of crisis is one of the most important clues we have, and it points strongly towards certain explanations over others. It suggests that the dancing was not random, but was somehow connected to the extreme stress and suffering of the populations it struck. We will return to this clue when we examine the theories, because it may be the single most important piece of the puzzle. Third, the pattern reveals the deep cultural context in which these outbreaks occurred. The people of medieval and early modern Europe lived in a world where compulsive dancing was a known and feared phenomenon, associated with saints and curses and divine forces. They had a framework for understanding it, a set of beliefs and expectations about what it was and what it meant. And this shared cultural understanding, this pre-existing belief in the reality of dancing curses and dancing afflictions, may itself have been a crucial ingredient in producing the outbreaks. A population that firmly believes a dancing curse is real, that knows the stories of Saint Vitus and the dancing manias of the past, that lives in fear of such an affliction, is a population primed, in a sense, for that very affliction to manifest. This is a subtle and powerful idea, and it sits at the very center of the leading modern explanation for the dancing plague, which we will come to soon. So the dancing plague of 1518 was the culmination, the final great chapter of a phenomenon that had haunted Europe for centuries. It was the best documented and one of the last major outbreaks of a recurring affliction, dancing mania, that appeared again and again in times of crisis across the medieval world. And this raises the great question, the question that has occupied historians and scientists and curious minds for 500 years, the question we have been building toward through this entire long and strange story. What caused it? What force? What mechanism? What affliction could make hundreds of people across centuries dance uncontrollably, suffer terribly, and die? Over the next chapters, we will explore the leading theories, the competing explanations that have been proposed to solve this enduring mystery. We will look at poison and at madness and at the strange and powerful workings of belief. And we will discover that, even now, even with all our modern knowledge, the dancing plague has never fully given up its secret. Before we turn to the theories that try to explain the dancing plague directly, we must take a detour far to the south, away from the cold and famine-stricken cities of the Rhine to the sun-baked lands of southern Italy. Because there, in the heel of the Italian peninsula, in the region around the city of Taranto, there existed for centuries another strange tradition of compulsive dancing, one that offers a fascinating and illuminating parallel to the dancing manias of the north. It was called Tarantism. And though it was different in important ways from what happened in Strasbourg, it shares so many haunting features with the northern dancing plagues that it deepens the whole mystery and points us towards something important about the human capacity for this kind of affliction. The tradition of Tarantism centered on a belief about a spider. In the region around Taranto, it was believed that the bite of a particular spider, which came to be associated with the name tarantula, could produce a strange and dangerous condition in its victim. A person bitten by this spider, the belief held, would fall into a state of profound distress, a kind of madness or melancholy or physical affliction, sometimes accompanied by pain, restlessness, and an overwhelming compulsion. And there was only one cure for this condition, only one way to drive the spider's venom out of the body and restore the victim to health. The victim had to dance, and not just any dancing. The cure required a specific kind of frenzied, vigorous dancing, performed to specific music played at a fast and driving tempo. Musicians would be summoned to play for the afflicted, and the music they played, with its rapid, insistent rhythm, came to be known as the tarantella, a name and a musical form that survives to this day. The victim of the spider's bite, the tarantato, would dance to this music, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, often to the point of total exhaustion. The dancing was understood as the means by which the venom was sweated and worked out of the body. The afflicted would dance and dance, driven by the music and by the compulsion of the bite, until at last the venom was expelled and the person recovered, collapsing in exhaustion but cured. This tradition was remarkably persistent. Unlike the northern dancing manias, which appeared as sudden epidemic outbreaks and then vanished, Tarantism endured as an ongoing cultural practice in southern Italy for many centuries, recurring year after year, often clustered around particular times such as the height of summer or the feast days of certain saints. It became woven into the fabric of local life and belief, a recognized affliction with a recognized cure, complete with its own music, its own rituals, its own traditions. People genuinely believed in it, genuinely experienced it, and genuinely sought the dancing cure, generation after generation, into surprisingly recent times. In fact, scholars were still studying living examples of Tarantism in southern Italy well into the 20th century, documenting the afflicted and their dancing cures with the tools of modern anthropology. Now, what are we to make of this? What does a spider cult in southern Italy have to do with hundreds of people dancing themselves to death in Strasbourg? On the surface, they seem quite different. The Tarantism of the south was attributed to a specific physical cause, a spider's bite, and the dancing was understood as a cure, something the afflicted sought out deliberately. The dancing plague of the north appeared as a spontaneous, terrifying epidemic, with no spider and no sought-after cure, and the dancing was the affliction itself, not the remedy. These are real and important differences, and we should not collapse the two phenomena into one. And yet, look at what they share. In both cases, we have people seized by a compulsion to dance, dancing to the point of exhaustion in a state that seems beyond their ordinary control. In both cases, the dancing is bound up with a powerful, culturally specific belief, a belief in the spider's venom in the south, a belief in saints and curses in the north. In both cases, music and ritual play a central role, and in both cases, the phenomenon is shaped profoundly by what the people involved believe to be happening. The Tarantado dances because he believes the spider's bite compels him to, and believes the dancing will cure him. And whatever was happening in Strasbourg, it too seems to have been shaped by what the dancers believed, by their cultural understanding of dancing afflictions and saintly curses. This is the crucial insight that the comparison with Tarantism offers us. It suggests that the human capacity for compulsive dancing, for falling into a state where the body seems to dance against the will, is something real, something that recurs across different cultures and different centuries, and something that is deeply shaped by belief and expectation. The specific form it takes, the spider in the south, the saint in the north, depends on the local culture. But the underlying capacity, the human potential to be swept into a compulsive, trance-like dancing state, seems to be something broader, something that different cultures channeled and understood in different ways. Some scholars have questioned whether the spider's bite had anything to do with the real cause of Tarantism at all, suggesting that the venom was, in many cases, simply the culturally accepted explanation for a phenomenon whose true roots lay elsewhere, in the mind, in the body, in the social and emotional pressures of the people involved. The bite gave permission, in a sense, gave a socially acceptable reason for a kind of cathartic, frenzied release through dancing. And that idea, the idea of dancing as a permitted release, a culturally sanctioned outlet shaped by belief, driven by something deeper than any physical cause, will prove central when we come to the leading modern explanation for the dancing plague itself. The spider's dance of southern Italy, in other words, is a clue. It shows us that compulsive dancing, bound up with belief and ritual and music, is a recurring feature of human experience, not a one-time freak. And it points us toward the possibility that the answer to the mystery of Strasbourg may lie not in the body alone, but in the strange and powerful territory where the mind, the body, the culture, and belief all meet. But before we explore that possibility fully, we must give a fair hearing to the most famous physical explanation for the dancing plague, the theory that has captured the public imagination more than any other. The theory that the dancers were not driven by belief or by madness, but by something in the very bread they ate. The theory of poison. Of all the explanations that have been proposed for the dancing plague, one has captured the popular imagination more than any other, perhaps because it offers something deceptively simple and satisfying. A physical cause, a toxin, a poison in the food supply that drove people mad and set them dancing. This is the theory of ergotism, and it is worth examining carefully, both because it is genuinely fascinating and because, in the end, it appears unable to bear the weight that has been placed upon it. The theory centers on a fungus. Ergot is the name of a fungus that grows on grains, particularly on rye, especially in cool, damp conditions. When rye is harvested and stored after a wet growing season, it can become contaminated with this fungus, which forms dark, hardened growths on the grain. And here is the crucial point. Ergot is poisonous. It contains a range of powerful chemical compounds, alkaloids, that have dramatic effects on the human body and mind when consumed. And so, if people ate bread made from rye contaminated with ergot, they could be poisoned by these compounds, sometimes with terrible results. The effects of ergot poisoning, a condition known as ergotism, can take different forms, and they are genuinely horrifying. In one form, The alkaloids constrict the blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the extremities, causing a burning sensation, and in severe cases leading to gangrene, the death and blackening of fingers, toes, and limbs. This terrible affliction was known in the medieval world, where it was sometimes called St. Anthony's fire for the burning sensation it produced and the saint whose intercession was sought against it. In another form, the poisoning affects the nervous system and the brain, producing convulsions, spasms, twitching, and, remarkably, hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. This is because some of the compounds in ergot are chemically related to powerful mind-altering substances. In fact, the famous hallucinogenic drug LSD was first synthesized from ergot alkaloids, which gives you a sense of just how potent the mind-altering effects of this fungus can be. You can see, immediately, why this theory is so appealing as an explanation for the dancing plague. Here is a poison present in the food supply, capable of causing convulsions, twitching, spasms, and hallucinations that grows on grain in damp conditions. And recall what we know about Strasbourg in 1518. It was a time of failed harvests, of cold and wet weather, of hunger so severe that people may have been forced to eat whatever grain they could get, including grain that was old, damp, or spoiled. The conditions seem, at first glance, perfect for an outbreak of ergotism. Desperate, hungry people eating contaminated rye, poisoned by a fungus that causes convulsions and hallucinations. Could this be the answer? Could the dancers of Strasbourg have been suffering from mass ergot poisoning, their twitching and spasming bodies and their altered minds the product of a toxin in their daily bread? It is a compelling story, and for a long time it was one of the leading explanations proposed by serious scholars and widely repeated. But when we examine it closely, the theory runs into serious, and many would say fatal, problems. And it is worth walking through these objections because they reveal a great deal about what the dancing plague actually was and was not. The first and perhaps most damning objection concerns the nature of the symptoms. Ergot poisoning, in its convulsive form, produces convulsions, seizures, spasms, and twitching. But these are not the same as dancing. Dancing, even compulsive, frenzied dancing, involves coordinated, sustained, purposeful movement. The dancers of Strasbourg were not having seizures. They were not twitching on the ground. They were dancing, moving in a coordinated way, often for days on end. Convulsions and coordinated dancing are very different things, and ergotism produces the former, not the latter. A person in the grip of ergot-induced convulsions could not dance in any meaningful sense, let alone dance continuously for days. The second objection is even more powerful, and it concerns the physical effects of ergot on the body. Remember that one of the primary effects of ergot poisoning is to constrict the blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the limbs and causing gangrene. This is the opposite of what you would need to dance for days on end. A person whose blood supply to their legs and feet was being cut off, whose extremities were burning and dying, would be physically incapable of sustained, vigorous dancing. The very mechanism that makes ergot so dangerous, its constriction of blood flow, would make the kind of marathon dancing seen in Strasbourg impossible. The bodies of the afflicted, far from being able to dance for days, would have been failing in entirely different ways. A third objection concerns the pattern of who was affected and how. If the dancing plague were caused by contaminated grain, we would expect the poisoning to strike people based on what they ate, affecting households and families who shared the same tainted bread, spreading through the population according to the distribution of the contaminated grain. But this is not how the dancing plague behaved. It spread, as we have seen, in a manner that looked more like social contagion, passing from the afflicted to those who watched them, gathering people into the dancing through some process that had nothing to do with what they had eaten. The dancing plague spread like a behavior, like an idea, not like a case of food poisoning. And finally, there is the broader pattern we have already discussed. the dancing manias recurred across centuries in different places under different conditions. For ergotism to be the explanation, we would have to suppose that contaminated grain happened to produce these very specific dancing outbreaks again and again across vast spans of time and space, always taking the same peculiar form of compulsive, contagious, coordinated dancing. This strains credulity. The recurring, patterned nature of the dancing manias points towards something other than sporadic food contamination. For all these reasons, most serious scholars who have studied the dancing plague in recent times have rejected the ergotism theory, or at least concluded that it cannot be the primary explanation. The poison in the bread, however appealing as a simple answer, simply does not fit the facts. The dancers danced in a coordinated way for days, spreading the affliction socially in a pattern repeated across centuries. Ergot poisoning can explain none of this, and so we are driven by the failure of the physical explanation toward a different and far stranger kind of answer. An answer that locates the cause not in the body, not in the bread, but in the mind. And in the powerful, mysterious, and very real phenomenon by which the human mind, under extreme pressure, can produce astonishing effects in the body and can spread those effects like a contagion from person to person. If the dancing plague was not caused by a poison in the bread, then what was it? If we rule out ergot, if we set aside the simple physical explanation, we are left facing a far more unsettling and far more fascinating possibility. The possibility that the dancing plague was, at its root, a phenomenon of the mind, that it was a real physical affliction with real physical consequences, including death, but one whose origin lay not in any toxin or infection, but in the human psyche itself, under conditions of extreme and unbearable stress. This is the leading explanation among scholars who have studied the dancing plague most deeply in recent times, and it goes by a name that sounds, at first, dismissive, but which describes something genuine and powerful. Mass psychogenic illness, or, in older language, mass hysteria. Now, we have to be very careful with this term because it is easily misunderstood. When people hear the phrase mass hysteria, they often imagine something fake, something hysterical in the dismissive sense. People working themselves up over nothing, imagining symptoms that are not real. That is not what we are talking about. Mass psychogenic illness refers to something genuine and involuntary. It describes situations in which real, physical symptoms the sufferer cannot control and is not faking, arise from psychological causes, from the mind, rather than from any physical toxin or pathogen, and then spread through a group of people. The symptoms are real. The suffering is real. The sufferers are not pretending or imagining, but the cause lies in the psyche, in the powerful and often mysterious connection between mind and body, rather than in any physical agent. This may sound strange, even unbelievable, if you have not encountered the idea before, but the phenomenon is well documented, and it continues to occur even in our own time. There are numerous recorded cases, including modern ones, of groups of people, often in enclosed and stressful environments like schools or workplaces, suddenly developing real physical symptoms: fainting, nausea, twitching, difficulty breathing, strange pains that spread rapidly through the group, that cannot be traced to any physical cause, and that are ultimately understood to be psychogenic in origin, produced by stress and anxiety, and spread by suggestion. The mind, under the right conditions, can produce remarkably real physical effects, and those effects can spread from person to person through a process of suggestion and shared expectation, like a kind of psychological contagion. The leading modern proponent of this explanation for the dancing plague, the historian who has perhaps done more than anyone to make the case, has argued that what happened in Strasbourg was precisely such an event, a mass psychogenic illness on an extraordinary scale produced by a unique and terrible combination of circumstances. And the argument is genuinely compelling. because it fits the evidence in a way that no other explanation does. Let us walk through how it works, because it brings together so many of the threads we have already followed. Begin with the suffering. We have spent considerable time on the misery of Strasbourg in 1518. The famine, the disease, the cold, the fear, the years of relentless hardship that had pushed the population to the very edge of what human beings can endure. This is the essential foundation. Mass psychogenic illness, when it produces dramatic outbreaks like this, tends to arise in populations under extreme and prolonged stress. Populations that are frightened, traumatized, pushed beyond their limits. And Strasbourg in 1518 was exactly such a population. The people were suffering an almost unimaginable burden of fear and grief and physical privation. Their minds and bodies were stretched to the breaking point. This created the conditions, the psychological tinder in which such an outbreak could ignite. Now add the second crucial ingredient: belief. Recall what we learned about St. Vitus and about the deep, pre-existing cultural belief in dancing curses and dancing afflictions. The people of this region did not merely suffer. They suffered within a particular framework of belief, a framework that included the very specific idea that a person could be cursed with uncontrollable dancing, that St. Vitus could inflict this affliction, that dancing manias were a real and known phenomenon. This belief was already present in their minds, part of their cultural inheritance, a possibility their imaginations were primed to recognize and to fear. And this is essential because in mass psychogenic illness, the specific form that the symptoms take is shaped by the expectations and beliefs of the sufferers. The mind expresses its distress through the channels that the culture makes available. In a culture that believes in dancing curses, the distress of a broken population might well express itself through, of all things, dancing. Put these two ingredients together, and you begin to see how it could happen. A population pushed past the edge of endurance by years of suffering. A deep, shared belief in the reality of dancing afflictions and saintly curses. And then, perhaps, a single trigger. A single person who, overwhelmed by it all, falls into a dissociative, trance-like state and begins to dance, exactly as Frau Troffea did. And because the belief in dancing curses is so deeply held, because the population is so stressed and so primed, the sight of that first dancer triggers the same response in others. They too fall into the trance. They too begin to dance. And the affliction spreads, person to person, through suggestion and shared belief, and the contagious power of a population at its breaking point, until hundreds are caught in its grip. Not poisoned, not infected, but swept into a collective, involuntary, trance-like state, a mass expression of unbearable psychological distress, channeled through the cultural belief in dancing curses and spreading like wildfire through a population perfectly primed to receive it. This explanation accounts for so much that the other theories cannot. It explains why the dancing plague struck a population in extreme distress. It explains the social, contagious spread, passing from person to person like a behavior rather than a poison. It explains the connection to belief, to St. Vitus, to the cultural framework of dancing curses. It explains why the religious intervention at the shrine might have helped to end it, because if the affliction grew from belief, then a powerful ritual addressing that very belief could help to dispel it. And it explains the recurring pattern across the centuries, since the same combination of extreme stress and cultural belief could produce similar outbreaks wherever and whenever those conditions arose. The mass psychogenic explanation, in short, fits the shape of the dancing plague better than anything else we have, but it rests on a deeper foundation, an idea so important and so strange that it deserves a chapter of its own. The idea that belief itself, the things we hold to be true in the depths of our minds, can reach into the body and produce real, physical, even deadly effects. The idea that a thought, a fear, a conviction shared among a frightened people can make them dance until they die. This is the power of belief, and it may be the true and final key to the mystery of 1518. We have arrived at the deepest and strangest idea in this entire story, the idea upon which the leading explanation of the dancing plague ultimately rests. It is the idea that belief, the things we hold to be true in the hidden depths of our minds, can reach down into the body and produce real, physical, measurable effects so powerful that they can, in the most extreme cases, even kill. This sounds like superstition. It sounds like magic. But it is, in fact, one of the most well-established and most mysterious truths that modern science has uncovered about human beings. And once you understand it, the dancing plague begins to make a terrible kind of sense. Let us begin with something you have almost certainly heard of, because it is the gentlest and most familiar example of this power: the placebo effect. When a person is given a treatment that has no active medical properties at all, a sugar pill, a harmless injection of saline, an entirely inert remedy, but believes that it is real medicine, they will often experience genuine improvement in their condition, real reduction in pain, real easing of symptoms, measurable physical changes in the body, not imagined improvement, but actual physiological change produced by nothing more than the belief that they have been treated. The expectation of healing produces healing. The mind, convinced that relief is coming, reaches into the body and makes it so. This is not fringe science. It is so robust, so reliable, that medical researchers must account for it in every drug trial they conduct, because the power of belief to produce real effects is strong enough to muddy the results of serious experiments. Now, consider the darker mirror of the placebo effect, which scientists call the nocebo effect. If belief in healing can produce healing, then belief in harm can produce harm. If a person is convinced that something will make them sick, that they have been cursed, that they are doomed, that conviction alone can produce real physical symptoms, real suffering, and in extreme cases, real deterioration. There are documented cases, studied seriously by physicians and anthropologists, of people who fell gravely ill or even died after becoming utterly convinced that they had been cursed or were fated to die, with no physical cause that medicine could identify. The belief itself appeared to be the agent. The conviction of doom, held with absolute certainty, seemed able to shut the body down. The mind, persuaded that death was coming, could apparently usher it in. This is the power we are dealing with. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, but a genuine and documented capacity of the human mind to produce profound physical effects through belief alone. And when we add to this the phenomenon of suggestion, the way that ideas and states can pass from one person to another, the picture grows more powerful still. Human beings are extraordinarily suggestible, especially in states of high emotion, fear, and stress, and especially in groups. We catch each other's emotions. We absorb each other's expectations. We fall, sometimes, into shared states of mind that none of us would have entered alone. Think of how panic can sweep through a crowd, how laughter can become contagious, how a mood can spread through a room. Now imagine that capacity for shared psychological states amplified to its absolute extreme in a population already broken by suffering, already primed by belief, already standing at the very edge. And consider, too, the phenomenon of the trance, the dissociative state in which a person's ordinary consciousness recedes and their body acts in ways that feel, to them, beyond their control. Trance states are real and well documented. They appear in many cultures, often in religious or ritual contexts, where people enter altered states of consciousness and may move, dance, speak, or behave in ways they later cannot fully account for. In such states, the ordinary sense of willing one's own actions can fall away. The body moves, but the self feels like a passenger rather than a driver. People in deep trance can sometimes perform feats of endurance that would be impossible in ordinary consciousness. pushing their bodies far past the limits that pain and exhaustion would normally enforce. The trance, in a sense, unlocks the body, removing the ordinary brakes, allowing it to be driven to extremes. Now bring all of these threads together and lay them over the city of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. A population shattered by years of famine, disease, and fear, their minds and bodies stretched past the breaking point. A deep, shared, culturally inherited belief in the reality of dancing curses, in the power of St. Vitus to seize a person and make them dance. An extraordinary suggestibility, born of mass stress and shared terror, and the human capacity to fall into dissociative, trance-like states in which the body moves beyond the control of the will and can be driven past its normal limits. Put these together, and you have, perhaps, the recipe for the dancing plague. A single person, overwhelmed, slips into a dancing trance, exactly as the belief in dancing curses says she should. The sight of her, in a population so primed and so stressed, triggers the same state in others through suggestion and shared belief. They too enter the trance. They too begin to dance, and the affliction spreads, mind to mind, belief reaching into body after body, until hundreds are caught in a collective trance, dancing out the unbearable distress of a broken people in the form their culture had taught them to expect. And because they were in a trance, because the ordinary limits had been unlocked, they could dance far past the point where pain and exhaustion would normally have stopped them. They could dance until their feet bled and their muscles tore and still not stop, because the part of them that would normally have stopped was no longer in command. And so they danced, some of them, until their hearts gave out. Belief, reaching all the way down into the body, driving it past every limit, all the way to death. The mind, persuaded that it was cursed to dance, dancing itself into the grave. This is the power of belief. It is not magic, though it can look like magic. It is a real, documented, and still not fully understood capacity of the human mind to shape and even to break the body it inhabits. And it suggests that the dancing plague, for all its strangeness, was not a violation of how human beings work, but an extreme and terrible expression of it. The dancers of Strasbourg were not poisoned, and they were not faking, and they were not, in the ordinary sense, mad. They were, perhaps, caught in the most extreme demonstration in all of recorded history of the power of the human mind, under unbearable pressure and shaped by unshakable belief to seize control of the body and drive it to destruction. If this is true, then the dancing plague is not just a historical curiosity. It is a window into one of the deepest and most unsettling truths about what we are. And yet, for all the compelling power of the explanation we have just explored, we must end this part of our journey with a confession, an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what we can truly know. Because the truth is that no one, not the most brilliant historian, not the most careful scientist, can tell you with absolute certainty what caused the dancing plague of 1518. The mass psychogenic explanation is the most persuasive we have. It fits the evidence better than any rival, but it cannot be proven, and the mystery, in the end, remains a mystery. Let us be honest about why. The fundamental problem is the distance. 500 years separate us from the streets of Strasbourg. 5 centuries lie between us and the dancers, an immense gulf of time across which only fragments of evidence have survived. We cannot examine the afflicted. We cannot question them about what they felt, what they experienced, what was happening in their minds. We cannot run tests, take measurements, observe the outbreak as it happened. We have only the records that chance has preserved, the civic documents, the physician's notes, the chronicles, the scattered accounts written by people who saw or heard of the events. And these sources, precious as they are incomplete, fragmentary, and shaped by the assumptions and limitations of the people who created them. They tell us much, but they leave enormous gaps, and into those gaps we can only reason and speculate and guess. Consider how much we do not know. We do not know, with certainty, how many people died. We do not know the precise sequence of events, the exact numbers, the day-by-day progression of the outbreak. We do not know the names and stories of nearly all the afflicted. We do not know what they experienced in their own minds, whether they felt themselves to be in a trance, whether they suffered hallucinations, whether they wished to stop or felt compelled or something else entirely. We do not know the full details of the response, the treatments, the rituals. We are working, always, with a partial picture, reconstructed from fragments, and any explanation we offer must be held with appropriate humility. And so, while most serious scholars today favor the mass psychogenic explanation, we should be honest that it remains a theory, a best interpretation rather than a proven fact. It cannot be tested in the way a scientific hypothesis can be tested. It rests on inference, on the fit between the theory and the surviving evidence, on analogy with better documented cases of mass psychogenic illness. This is a reasonable and powerful basis for belief, but it is not certainty. It is entirely possible that there were factors at work that we do not understand, that the surviving evidence misleads us in some way, that the true story was more complex or simply different from our best reconstruction. The dancing plague guards its final secret still. We should also acknowledge that the various explanations need not be entirely exclusive of one another. The real story may have involved a combination of factors that we have considered separately. The extreme stress and the cultural belief may have provided the foundation, while other elements, physical exhaustion, perhaps some contribution from poor nutrition or spoiled food, the dynamics of crowds and suggestion, the specific actions of the authorities, all played their part in shaping how the outbreak unfolded and how deadly it became. Reality is often messier than our clean theories, and the dancing plague may have been the product of many forces converging at once, in a particular place, at a particular moment, in a way that can never be precisely disentangled across the gulf of centuries. There is something fitting, even appropriate, in this irreducible uncertainty. The dancing plague was, at its heart, a phenomenon of the human mind, and the human mind is the deepest mystery we know. We have made enormous progress in understanding the brain, the psyche, the strange connections between mind and body, but we are very far from understanding it fully, and the most extreme and unusual expressions of the mind's power, like the dancing plague, lie at the very edge of what we can explain. Perhaps it is right that this event, which speaks so directly to the unfathomable depths of the human psyche, should retain a core of mystery that we cannot dissolve. Perhaps the dancing plague is a reminder that there are things about ourselves that we still do not understand and may never fully understand. What we can say, with confidence, is this. Something extraordinary happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. Hundreds of people danced uncontrollably in the streets of their city for days and weeks, suffering terribly, and many of them dying until the affliction finally subsided. This is real. This happened. It is one of the strangest and most haunting events in all of recorded history, and it is true. And whatever its precise cause, it reveals something profound about human beings, about our fragility, about the power of suffering and belief, about the strange and terrible things that can happen when the human mind is pushed past the edge of what it can bear. The dancing plague remains a mystery, but it is a mystery that teaches us something, even in its unsolved state, and that, perhaps, is the most we can ask of it. And so we come to the end of our long journey together, back to the quiet, back to the dark, back to the stillness of the present moment. The dancing has stopped now. It stopped 500 years ago, in a city by the river, when the last of the afflicted finally fell still, and the terrible music of those weeks at last gave way to silence. Let us linger here, in these final quiet moments, and consider what this strange and sorrowful story leaves us with, as the centuries settle back into place around us, and the night draws on towards sleep. Imagine Strasbourg in the autumn of 1518 after it was over. The stages dismantled, the hired musicians long since paid and gone. The streets and squares, which had been filled for weeks with the ceaseless motion of hundreds of dancing bodies, now empty, now quiet, now returned to their ordinary uses. The survivors back in their homes, carrying the memory of what they had endured. The families of the dead, grieving losses they could barely comprehend, mourning loved ones taken not by sword or plague or accident, but by dancing, by an affliction that had no name they could trust and no cause they could understand. A city marked forever by something it would never be able to fully explain, slowly, quietly, returning to life beneath the great spire of its cathedral, beside the river that flowed on as it always had, indifferent to the strange thing that had happened on its banks. What does it mean, this story? What are we to take from it? We who hear it now, 5 centuries later, safe and warm in a world the people of Strasbourg could never have imagined. Perhaps, more than anything, the dancing plague is a story about the human mind and about how much more powerful and more fragile and more mysterious it is than we usually allow ourselves to believe. We like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, in command of our own bodies, masters of our own actions, and most of the time, we are. But the dancing plague reveals what can happen when that command breaks down, when suffering and fear and belief combine to overwhelm the ordinary self, and the body slips free of the will entirely. It reveals that the line between control and compulsion, between sanity and the strange states that lie beyond it, is thinner than we like to think. That under the right pressure, in the right conditions, any of us might be swept into currents we did not choose and cannot resist. And it is a story about suffering, about what happens to human beings when they are pushed past the limits of what they can bear. The dancers of Strasbourg did not come from nowhere. They were the product of years of famine, disease, fear, and hardship, of a world that had ground them down until something inside them broke. The dancing plague was, in a sense, the scream of a broken people, the unbearable distress of a suffering population finding expression in the strangest and most terrible of forms. And in that sense, it speaks to something timeless, something that did not end in 1518. For human beings are still pushed past their limits. Populations still suffer, still break, still find strange and unexpected ways for their distress to surface. The specific form of the dancing plague belongs to its own time and place, to the world of St. Vitus and humoral medicine and medieval belief. But the deeper truth it reveals, that suffering shapes us in ways we do not choose, that the mind under unbearable pressure can do astonishing things, is as true today as it was then. There is a strange comfort, I think, in sitting with a story like this here in the dark. Not comfort in the suffering, which was real and terrible, but comfort in the act of remembering, of carrying these long-dead people and their incomprehensible ordeal with us across the centuries, of refusing to let them be entirely forgotten. The dancers of Strasbourg have been gone for 500 years. Their names, almost all of them, are lost. Their individual stories, their hopes and fears and lives have vanished into time. But the memory of what happened to them survives, and in hearing it, in turning it over in our minds, in wondering about it as we drift towards sleep, we keep a small flame of remembrance alive for them. We acknowledge that they lived and suffered, and that their strange fate still matters, still moves us, still has something to teach us all these centuries later. So as you lie there now, in the quiet and the warmth, let the image of that long-ago city settle gently in your mind. The empty streets, swept clean of dancers. The silence after all that terrible motion. The river flowing on beneath the stars. And the great unanswered question, hanging in the dark over the centuries, never quite resolved, never quite put to rest. Why did they dance? We do not fully know. We may never fully know. And there is a kind of peace, in the end, in allowing a mystery to remain a mystery, in letting the question rest unanswered, in accepting that some of the strangest doors in history will never be entirely opened. As always, thank you for spending this long night here with me, journeying together into one of the strangest and most haunting mysteries that history has ever left behind. If this quiet wandering through the story of the dancing plague soothed you, or moved you, or simply carried you gently towards sleep, then consider leaving a like and subscribing if you have not already, so that we can keep exploring these forgotten and shadowed corners of the past together, night after night. And do let me know, down in the comments, what stayed with you most from this strange tale as you drifted, and whether you, too, find yourself wondering what could truly make a person dance until they could dance no more. Until next time, rest easy. Let the music of that distant summer fade into silence, and the dancers find their stillness at last, and the centuries settle softly into the dark around you. You are safe, and you are warm, and the long mystery of Strasbourg is very far away tonight. Sleep well, and stay curious.